Well, hello everyone at Impellum Group. I am excited to be with you today to honor Transgender Day of Visibility. Um, there's been some amazing accomplishments for the transgender community over the last couple of years that I just wanted to highlight quickly. Dr. Rachel Levine became the country's highest ranking openly transgender official. Sarah McBride, the Delaware lawmaker, made history twice over when she was elected as the first openly transgender state senator. Lena Bloom, the actress, dancer, and activist, is the first Black and Asian American transgender model to appear in the iconic Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. But then Kate and I, who I'll share with you more about who she is, but Kate mentioned another important one that I had missed. So Kate, I'm going to let you share about that legislation.
Sure. Yeah. So currently the fight for the transgender soul is happening in the courts more than anywhere. So we are seeing a host of positive developments across, probably about a dozen states. But probably the biggest win in recent history was the landmark Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County. And that enshrined protections for transgender people in the workplace. It expanded the definition on the basis of sex to include transgender people. And that's kind of very much our North Star right now. So it was a 5-4 decision. It was in the margins, but luckily it broke our way, and it's helping paving better futures for people like me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So for our audience, now I get to introduce you to my friend, Kate Anthony. She's the CEO of Euphoria, and she is just a true friend of mine. So Kate, I'm going to pass it over to you to share a little bit about Euphoria and how you all are supporting the transgender community, as well as maybe a little bit about your story so people can know your background.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Kate Anthony. I am a woman who happens to be transgender. That's kind of the moniker that I use these days. And I am fortunate to run Euphoria. We create technology to assist the transgender soul through gender transition. And we have 4 apps in the marketplace right now that all focus on a great pain of gender transition. Whether it's accruing the necessary information in terms of getting from point A to point B, having access to a banking account that accepts you for who you are, and you can get a debit card in your true name, tools of daily psychological affirmation that are tailored to the user's mood and gender, and even tools of self-discovery. So the sum of all of our apps is the largest platform on earth for the transgender community. We are seeing that our users experience about a 75% decrease in suicide ideation and self-harm from using our tech. So what's clear to us is that the community, folk like me, we needed better than the support groups. We needed more than church basements, trading around bootleg medical information. And we needed real tools to help get through this incredibly complex process. And most of it's rooted in my own transition. I had to go through that model of oral tradition to find that early information on how do you get it done. I've been trying to build tools concurrently with my transition that helps elevate other people. So I'm a woman of my own product. It's kind of fun to call myself a self-made woman for a myriad of reasons. But that certainly extends to both the business world and who I am today.
I love that. So there's 2 things I think I want to point out there. One is that I personally use the Devotion app, and it's a beautiful one for allies. Receiving affirmations is my favorite, and I know you and I have even shared affirmations in the past. Another one I wanted to mention, just because I think we've talked about this outside, is it feels like your technology, that Euphoria, is augmenting the community. And it's not just, you've mentioned before, it's not to replace the community, but it is also a safe space for people who want to research and may not have those personal resources of in-person individuals to speak with. Do you want to just share a little bit about that? Because I think that's important.
Yeah. So I think for a lot of people, kind of the assumption that there is this baked in transgender community everywhere and we're lifting each other up. That's challenging from a couple fronts. One, if you're in the deep rural, the likelihood of running into someone else and having that sense of community is going to be greatly diminished. So that's where technology can be a great agent of change. and making it more accessible to those individuals. But like any community, people like me are tied together by a similar, unique genetic sequence. But beyond that, we're a fairly agnostic group in terms of the overlapping similarities. So for someone like me, I wanted a much more individualized journey through transition. I didn't want to have a bunch of peers around me. I didn't want to be measuring myself against someone the whole way through. And so that's where our technology has really been helpful for people and just providing different pathways. The whole thesis of our company is providing dignity and agency to the transgender soul. And that fundamentally comes to a position of choice. Do you work with a community? Do you go with an app? Do you use some fusion of both? Whichever way you do it, we just want to help you become who you are.
That's so good. And I think that goes well with where we're kind of going next in our conversation, the choice. And you and I have talked about that a lot. So for those of you who may not know me, I'm Esther Swati. I am a marketing director for Impellum Group, and I'm based in Austin. Kate and I met when I was at my last job, Galvanize, which was a co-working and boot camp space. And Kate became kind of my subject matter expert that I would go to as I was sitting on the ED&I Council and Steering Committee at Galvanize and was wanting to help bring change as an ally. And I wanted to be very careful about how I did things. And Kate was also always so transparent and radically open with me in regards to where efforts may fail or where they may actually support the transgender community. So I think, Kate, maybe one thing that you could share first is your perception of what it means or how to be an ally to the transgender community, and especially for companies or individuals who know they have gaps, but they still want to be an ally. So what do you think are some of the first things that we can do to be allies to your community?
Yeah. So I think, it's a complex equation because this is a really, really interesting phenomenon, why people are transgender. But we can start with some easy basics. So one is just having, real uniformity on the idea that trans women are women, trans men are men. Because ultimately what people like me are looking for is conformity. I just want to be treated like any other woman in the workplace. So for organizations to really embrace that mindset on the get-go is going to be how we lay the groundwork for better solutions moving forward. Because what I see sometimes is organizations will kind of put trans people into a third box. And that's where things get really problematic and challenging because the needs of transgender people are very similar to cisgender people. The struggle is rooted in exclusion. So how do we pull those people in? But there are certainly going to be moments or initiatives that do speak to some of the unique accommodations of someone in my community. So whether that's having a gender neutral segregated bathroom, that's a great thing for someone like me who's maybe feeling uncomfortable, going into the women's room in a larger corporate setting. It's also great for every other employee, for mothers who are nursing, for someone who's sick, or someone who, needs to administer, some sort of drug in the middle of the workday, for medical reasons. That kind of facility could be helpful there. So I think in the broadest strokes possible, it is pressing forward with just a earnest conviction that transgender people are very, very similar to their cisgender peers. And then when taking on those additional initiatives, really thinking about how they fundamentally not only improve transgender people, but how that extends to the entirety of the organization. And that's where I think you see change that sticks.
That's so good. And I think just to hit on the bathroom topic, because I know you and I have talked about it before, because I was working on an initiative to update signage. And one thing a friend of mine had mentioned was Nordstrom and how they have clear signage that says, you choose whichever restroom you feel comfortable using. And that was in addition to the unisex availability of bathrooms. And I thought that was a cool way to just be putting out an extra trust signal of we support you and your choices, to choose whichever bathroom you want to use. And I think that applies to not just transgender people, right? It applies to other individuals as well, as you're mentioning. So one thing you and I have talked about before too is how to create safe spaces at events, whether they're virtual or in person. I would love to hear your thoughts around that. We've talked about pronouns before, or just, I think the greater swath is setting the premise and the intention of it being a safe space that will be honored. So can you share a little bit maybe about your experiences and what you feel like are some of the positive things that speakers or moderators have done to create that welcoming and safe environment?
Yeah. So I think, in keeping with the theme of, conformity above all else, the things we want to steer away from are the activities that single out the transgender person. So that going around the room and asking for pronouns, that was a really well-intentioned practice put into place by cisgender people, but no transgender person wants to participate in that because we know we're getting singled out in that one. So for moderators, for events, virtual, in-person, or otherwise, there's great ways to broadcast, that inclusion without having to specifically spell it out. So a really cheap way of doing that at an in-person event, have a tiny trans flag somewhere. Put in a potted plant and make a pun out of it, call it a transplant or something, but just have some visible signage that clues in not only people like me that I'm welcomed, but tells everyone in the room that souls that, carry those colors are welcome here. So that's certainly one way to do it. I think the other way for moderators and speakers is to really just open with an anti-discriminatory policy. Here are our values. We support, XYZ characteristics, and you can cover a lot more than just gender as a protected class in that statement. But that's a great way to set the table without singling any protected class out. So I would just think about how do we wrap those into the just natural conversations that we're having already. And when we are in those spaces where people like me are in public or in networking events, just a little bit of signage or a little bit of those friendly flags is an incredible way to demonstrate that there's allyship in that space, which is, I think, what we all want to accomplish.
Yeah, that's so good. Those are such great notes that I want to keep track of, and make sure that we're doing for our events. So I guess the next thing I'd like to move into is taking action for employees who are potentially being introduced to this Transgender Day of Visibility or even the transgender community. What are kind of some recommendations you would have either on resources that they could look at to learn more or actions that they could take as an individual employee in an organization? And I know we've talked about before, speaking up when we see discrimination happening, but what are some other kind of high level actions do you think that our Impellum employees could take?
Yeah. So I think the biggest single action you can do that helps this community is embrace transgender people with love and kindness. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to have all these rules. You don't need to know every in and out as to, what my experience looks like. But if you can treat someone like me in conformity and with dignity for who they are, that's going to be the thing that ultimately makes the difference. A lot of organizations, well-meaning, are trying to create these structural rules on how do we interact with transgender people. But that always misses the mark because people feel bogged down. They start feeling skittish, like they can't fully participate in a conversation and they don't want to scare people off. And so, I really look to some of our interactions, back at Galvanize. I remember there was an instance where I got misgendered, by a member pretty directly, and it really, really hurt. And then the next day I came into the building, there was a bouquet of flowers on the desk with my name on it. And I'm trying not to tear up right now, but that really, really moved me. And that touched like just the fibers of my soul. And it's gestures like that that really, really help because it was this incredibly affirming moment. It was someone standing up in the face of a tough situation. And it was also an acknowledgement of saying, I can't fix everything out there, but I can make this one spot a little bit better for someone like you.
Mm.
So those are kind of the direct things that I'd really push people to, and definitely calling out the behavior. Allies are so much better positioned to argue for these things because they don't face the risk of the blowback.
Mm.
I was reading about an instance at South by Southwest just a couple days ago, and an individual was performing in drag and cross-dressing on stage. And a
Mhm.
parent of a transgender kid confronted them on that, and they said, "This is transphobic presentation, and we
Mm.
need to change this behavior because my kid's going to get bullied over this." And lo and behold, that person was really receptive, and they said, "I'd never thought about that, but I do want to be better." And
Mm.
that's just an example of an ally, in that case, a parent, using kind of the protections of their privilege to be able to contest with people who are perpetuating behavior that is setting my community back. So speak out and
Wow.
uplift.
That's so good. And I didn't mention any of these stats earlier, but I think it's important for people to know. I just read in Forbes that 52% of all transgender and non-binary young people in the US seriously contemplated killing themselves in 2020. And we've talked before about the staggering levels of poverty, discrimination, violence. Another stat was 375 transgender people were killed last year in 2021, a figure that is on the rise. So I think what you're mentioning is so important. And that is another reason why we honor this day, is the resilience of this community in light of those stats, and realizing that those stats are individual people who are being affected. And I know you and I have talked a lot about mental health, and I think that when allies can stand up, we can help protect the mental health of this community. And that's something I'm very passionate about. Is there anything kind of you want to mention along those lines? Just, I know personally, I recently traveled through an airport and experienced a situation where I got patted down. And you and I have talked about that before, about how, basic kind of things can be so much more difficult and discriminating to this community. And I think it was only until I experienced that situation as a woman that I realized, wow, this is some of the stuff that Kate has been talking to me about that I don't even realize are daily barriers. And so tied to what you just said about how we can't protect this community from all of the horrible things that are happening, but how do you think allies can help when it comes to the mental health of this community?
Yeah. So what we know about the mental health of the transgender community is that a lot of it stems from, the overwhelming majority is some form of PTSD. That is what rips through my community, and that is what causes the horrific death rate of every 3 minutes a transgender person dies from suicide. It's a gutting number to think about. It's horrific. And so, in terms of how we protect, it's a couple things. One is it's giving a little bit of grace. If someone like me is having a really rough go, like, it's not a unfair assumption that they would be suffering from that upcoming, from all that they've gone through to be who they are. The second thing with mental health is really keeping a strong firewall between saying, is this a transgender thing or is this a PTSD thing? There's a term in my community that's called trans broken arm syndrome. And that refers to the idea when something's hurting, people think it's always related to transition or how I'm transgender. And instead, in my personal case, and like many others, I can point to saying, no, I had these incredibly tough upbringings. I dealt with all these different traumas and trials, and that is fundamentally what's causing these diseases. So I think there's a lot of understanding that can be brokered on that front. And then kind of the last, the highest thing we can reach for in terms of helping this community on that front is making sure that there's competent resources within arm's reach. Making sure that the healthcare, covers, people like me. Making sure that, if there's a list of, providers or therapists that sometimes get circulated in offices, does it include people with trauma backgrounds? Because it's less about the phenomenon of why people, are transgender. It's more about a perpetual trauma response. And that's the thing we can focus on and and particularly allies, having that understanding can really make the difference in the lives of others.
Wow, that's so good. Thank you so much for sharing. I am so grateful for your taking the time to invest in me personally, as well as Impellum, to share about your experience. One thing that you and I kind of talk about a lot is this is an evolving conversation, and it is an evolving kind of situation for individuals and companies as well. And I think, for me, I feel like I always want to be transparent and honest about where I am may not be where I want to be. And I think it can be that way with companies as well. What you just mentioned, healthcare and varying resources. I'm so proud of Impellum for their commitment to continue to invest in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I am grateful for people like you who are creating resources for this community. So are there any kind of parting words you'd like to share to this audience, and just because you are, to me, a model of the resilience of this community and part of what I want to personally honor on this day. But I would love for you to be able to close with any additional thoughts you might want to share.
Yeah. I guess closing things out, TDOV is kind of the high holiday of the transgender community, juxtaposed with Transgender Day of Remembrance. So twice a year, we have honest, hard conversations, and then we have days of jubilation, and that's what this is. So if there's two things to take away, from what this day is, and particularly what it means as an ally, one, transgender people invite everyone to be who they are. We are incredibly visible. We go through immeasurable hardship to be exactly the men and women that we are. But that is a journey that anyone can be on. So as you see this visibility within my community, please see that as a torch that you can light your own candle with. And then I guess just the parting, idea in terms of how we further uplift this community and just, synthesize everything. Just embrace people for who they are, and you're going to do great. You see someone like me, long hair, makeup, and nails, throw a "hey girl" my way, and I will think about that interaction for the rest of my life. If you are feeling like you are behind the 8 ball, be transparent like Esther, and advance those learnings. And the cumulative effect of those 3 things is a future in which not only transgender people get to be themselves every day, but everyone gets to have that joy. And we all get to be visibly euphoric, and that feels like something worth reaching for. So I hope everyone can feel empowered on this day and take up that mantle of becoming exactly who you are, because you're amazing.
Oh, gosh. Thank you so much, Kate. That is such a great way to end our conversation. And I know that you've inspired me, and I hope that you inspire all of our Impellum North America employees, and look forward to furthering this conversation in the future.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.